Good evening, everyone. My name is Carmela, and today I am going to do a presentation on diabetes in Native American and African American communities. Additionally, I did another segment of this presentation just with audio recording so that viewers and followers can view the slides with me as I do this presentation. So essentially, my creative brief and presentation is capturing adjusted rates by ethnicity and age and sex that show very stark risk factors and higher incident rates of diabetes and dying from diabetes in American Indian and African American communities. And so a lot of this can be attributed to the prevalence of food deserts, inflammatory diets, epigenetic traits, but also racist healthcare and environmental policies in the U.S. And so what we do see from graphs that are presented presented in this presentation, we see in more contemporary years, specifically starting in the 2000s, onward into 2016. In this graph, we see that most cases of diabetes are prevalent in populations of Black women as compared to white women. And so we also see the increased prevalence of diabetes from the age of 18 to 35 in sample populations of American Indians. And so this is very important to understand and theorize upon, because these are age groups that are very influential and that maintain cultural and lifestyle habits for future and younger generations. So this is really where, things, learned lessons, taught habits, and lifestyle decisions really become affirmed and established in one's way of being. So we do a few health problem analysis, and we look at indirect contributing factors, while also compounded with risk and protective factors. And what we see are systemic and institutional indirect contributing factors that inform the direct choices of an individual, specifically in this case a Native American man who's 45, living on the Lakota reservation. And so what we do and what we see is risk and protective factors that are characterized as and by race-induced stress that then inform nutrigenomics, which is the way that this individual's body is biochemically metabolizing food and stress, but then also looking at going back to the indirect contributing factors as to why and what it is that this man's body is metabolizing. Is that an inflammatory diet with high sugar intake, and is there an excess level of stress due to neighborhood conditions and employment rates? But what we also see is that there are systemic factors that can contribute, such as a city cultural center that conducts bi-weekly community cultural gatherings. And so what this can do is offset these very unfortunate societal and economic conditions by means of exercise and cultural gatherings. And cultural gatherings is something that, and cultural expression is something very much essential to a nation of people. And so going further on into the presentation, we kind of begin to explore and look at how colonialism and cultural oppression within these populations has severed healthy habits. And so one thing that we need to work on is looking at practical ways to improve interactions with healthcare providers and indigenous peoples. So one of those things would be definitely acknowledging the legacy of colonialism and its ongoing adverse effects on Indigenous health. We would need to acknowledge the language barriers and the cultural fears that have been magnified in the wake of westernization, European settler dynamics of power over and power with, and really engaging with the cultural and historical norms of Indigenous peoples that inform bias, discrimination, and racism that continue to silence the risk factors and exposures that produce particular health outcomes within these communities. So any screening and preventative strategies need to implement the collaboration with community leaders, Indigenous peoples with diabetes, healthcare professionals, and funding agencies that will engage the culture, identity, and sense of being within these communities. I think more often than not within public health and preventative measures, we're looking at the health outcome as if it is something that is specifically within communities that have higher incident rates of this health outcome. We look at it as this, I think, accident, and there really is no accident. So if we continue on to look at legacies of colonization and its ongoing adverse effects of Indigenous health, we would understand that barriers to better health outcomes within these communities would obviously have to be the social and economic resource blockage for these communities. There's an accumulation of adverse life experiences. There is the mark of colonialization and oppression on its descendants, the descendants of the communities. We have systemic inequity, and lack of access to healthcare. So that is all compounded and formalized by institutionalized racism and biases that justified the genocide and land inquisition of Indigenous populations, and so it's become a vicious cycle. And the high incidence of diabetes is a symptom of a larger social disruption that has happened to these groups of people. The incidence of diabetes cannot be looked at isolated from the historical starting points and social oppression and cultural oppression of these people, which is why practical tips in working with healthcare providers and Indigenous people must acknowledge what has happened to these groups of people and produce ways and outlets, pathways, and spaces where Indigenous peoples can reclaim their culture and sense of identity as to better heal the abuses and the disease that is informing the community. So from these legacies of colonialism, we continue to see lack of dietary choices, lack of choices for physical activities, lack of treatment options and treatment choices. And again, there's a lack of space that is safe for healing, treatment, and recovery. And then furthermore, lack of support systems on an institutional level to a personal level. And of course, the neglect from the government. So within this, prevention program, it's very important that healing, culture, and health are one and the same. So allowing, again, cultural practices, traditions, and patient preferences to be heard, incorporated, and valued in treatments and management. Allowing culture and language to inform relationships of medical health providers and patients. Building a shared understanding of diabetes that integrates and contextualizes biomedical, social, political, and cultural frameworks, and using language that is appropriate to patients' educational and cultural background. So in other words, we tend to talk in very Western European dialect that is very linear, and I'm practicing and operating from that method of discussion right now. But what is proposed is considering interacting with illness and interacting with treatments in different ways, such as metaphors, proverbs, narrative approaches, prayer, meditation. These are nowadays described as being alternative holistic measures of healing, but these are actually the fundamental practices of indigenous and aboriginal cultures that again were stripped and taken from these populations upon encounter with European settlers. So these again are the things that we must look at upon treatment and diagnosis of diabetes. And there are so many things that we're not mentioning. And a lot of that, again, would have to connect to the land inquisition. I'm sure if there were, carried practices that were taught to future generations of how to tend the land and how to maintain land, how to grow food, how to, establish food gardens, the incidences and dependency on institutions that produce profit off of processed food would not be an issue. Diabetes would not be an issue for American Indians if colonialism and westernization did not impose on their cultural practices and ways of interacting with the land, with livestock, self and other, etc. So we would really need to critically reflect, specifically medical health care providers, on their conceptions and assumptions on health and indigenous perspectives, because more often than not, when you speak from this language that I'm sharing and expressing from today, and you are administrating Western medicine, you have a automatic power over, and this can be very detrimental to further treatment options and presentation of information and prevention programs to these communities. So just about to wrap this up, target audiences would need to be caseworkers, tribal governments, community leaders, community gatekeepers, influential members that are able to make lifestyle changes, school counselors, teachers, principals, even indigenous individuals and members of the community that are diagnosed with diabetes. These are the people that we really want to target with this information and with this prevention program. And I say that because, we could target parents and head of households. However, households tend to be broken, and households tend to be unable to apply the necessary changes needed to promote health. And again, this is not to reflect the capacity of the individual, it's a reflection of what is happening systemically. So we would need to make sure that we make very strong ties with community gatekeepers who reflect the physical representation of community members, but also can relate to the everyday realities that are faced on the Lakota reservation. So challenges again will be cultural practices, belief systems that have been produced and maintained by means of very oppressive and adverse lived experiences that then therefore spawn perceived barriers, fears, needs that we may not be aware of. There's a socioeconomic status that produces very unseen community issues, rules, customs, and dynamics, which is why community gatekeepers and leaders in the community that are at a place of position where they can apply changes and share information by means of communication and example is crucial, because there are many nuances and complexities of an oppressed community or marginal community that outsiders more often than not ignore or bypass due to ignorance, privilege, etc. And so we really want to make sure that that the culture of First Nations and Indigenous peoples are incorporated and invited to build, create, and introduce this program as something that is theirs, as something that can be sustained and maintained with or without, our leaders as an organization. But we also too want to make sure that we make strong ties to import and export ideas, connections, and resources from cities that are surrounding the Lakota Reservation. And so our tone of presenting this information must be positive, confident, inspirational, optimistic, hopeful, yet very humble, because there will be resistance and, again, perceived barriers of fear. It's very hard and scary to change, especially if someone is presenting to you a solution and in your mind or in the participant's mind, it is not seen as something that can directly change one's socioeconomic status or change the abuse that is happening in the household or change the sense of, the lack of knowing who you are or having a sense of recognition and place in the community. So our tone also must be very patient. So lastly, our communicational channels will need to be based off of and within community meetings, social media outreach, radio, billboard ads, community protests and rallies. And those protests and rallies are really great points of interaction and hearing the true voice and needs of the community and people. This is very crucial and important that we engage within activities and programs that are already established in the community. It's one thing to get up on stage, give a presentation, and expect for everyone to listen to you, but then when you go sit down and others begin to present their information, you zone out, you're on your phone, or you're sitting and thinking about what it is that you said. So we need to make sure that we bear witness to what current activities and programs are already active in the community. We need to make sure that there will be translations of material and information into local native tongues, Spanish, and audio-video recordings that are provided with subtitles. We need entertaining, colorful, and creative advertisement directed towards younger generations, catchy slogans and songs about lifestyle changes directed towards teenagers and adolescents, and the use of imagery that will be used to offset high rates of illiteracy. What we really want to do as well, due to the high rates of illiteracy and due to this very first world assumption that everyone can read and write, one of the very, I think, pre-colonial and parts of decolonization theory is looking at our language. And right now, again, we are speaking the language of English. And so what other ways can we communicate to the spirit and to the unseen? And one way we can do that is means through art. And we would love to use within our imagery textiles, ceramic work, feathers, drums, imagery of the landscape and of the earth. These are the types of things that we definitely want to make sure that there is, excuse me, I apologize, the video paused, so I had to fix it. But we really want to make sure that the use of art and imagery that is culturally sensitive is a way to speak and draw in the spirits of the creative spirit and the healing spirit within the community. So again, ensuring that our communication channels are a part of the indigenous cultural and religious events such as sundances, powwows, etc. So within this presentation, I thank you for bearing your time with me. We have looked at the incidences of diabetes within African American, but most specifically American Indian populations. We've looked at indirect contributing factors that interact with risk and protective factors. And we've talked about practical tips and ways that healthcare providers can be culturally sensitive and historically aware to the barriers that keep indigenous communities from receiving and experiencing better health outcomes. And then we also looked at who are we speaking to, what will keep us from speaking with these groups of people, what is our tone, and what is our method of expressing this information and message to the community. So with that, you have just listened to a presentation of diabetes in Native American and African American communities. I thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great night. Take care.